Hi there. When we're looking at organisational culture, a key model to have an awareness of and hopefully be able to apply is Handy's model of culture. So let's take a quick look at the four classes of culture that Charles Handy, a leading authority, spent his life looking at organisational culture. The four classes of culture that Handy identified. Let's just quickly summarise what each of those classes of culture were. Perhaps the most important, perhaps certainly the most easily recognisable class of culture was what Handy called the power culture, where power is held by just a few individuals in the organisation, in the business, and their influence, the influence of those few people, spreads throughout the business. Typically with a power culture, there are relatively few rules and regulations. What happens is those with power decide what happens. So if I'm an employee in such a business, I'll generally be judged by what I achieve rather than how I do things or how I act. And a consequence, perhaps a positive consequence of a power culture, is that this can typically lead to fairly quick decision making, even if those decisions aren't necessarily in the best long-term interests of the business. A power culture is typically considered to be strong. It's associated with strong culture. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, that that culture is positive. A strong culture can quickly turn toxic. Take a look at any reviews of the evidence from the collapse of businesses like RBS, Lehman Brothers, going further back, Enron, and the collapse of those businesses is often attributed to a strong power culture where a small number of individuals dominated the business. So power culture, all about a culture that's dominated by those at the top of the organisation, whether that's for good or bad. And the second culture Handy identified, again, is pretty typical, certainly of traditional organisations. He called it the role culture. Now here, a little bit different. The culture is based on the role that you play in the business. So this culture is characterized by a high degree of control, with everyone in the organization, everyone in the business, knowing what their role is and what their responsibilities are. So in this culture, in a role culture, power is determined by your position in the organizational hierarchy, in the organizational structure. What is your job? What are you responsible for? Who reports to you? Who do you report to? So the culture is built on the organizational structure. And typically, what Handy found was that organizations with a role culture had a tall, not a flat structure, with long chains of command from the top to the bottom. We know from looking at tall organizational structures that a consequence of that is that decision making can often be slow, sometimes painfully slow, and that organizations with this type of culture may be risk averse, less likely to be innovative. And of course, organizations with a role culture, if it's long established and well established, tend to be very bureaucratic in nature. Not great places to work, to be honest with you. The third culture that Handy identified was what he called a task culture, and this is really quite different from role culture. Task was the word, but actually task equals team. Task culture forms when teams in an organisation are formed, typically to address specific problems or to work on particular projects. But it's the task that is the important thing. So power within the team often shifts depending on who's in the team and also the status of the problem or the project. This is a very dynamic type of culture. The task determines the team dynamic. But if you get it right, if you get the right mixture of skills and personalities, abilities and leadership, as we know, effective teamwork can be very productive and very creative. And so typically a matrix structure often works best in an organisation that has a task culture. And finally, the fourth of the four, and Handy identified that this as being least likely, less frequent in terms of what he found in organisations, what he called the person culture. And this is really all about individual people, whereas task culture was all about the team. person culture is about the individual. Individuals in this type of business very much see themselves as unique and superior to the business itself. And really, the organisation just exists in order for people to work. The culture is really the result of a collection of individuals who happen to work for the same business. Not that frequent. I haven't come across it that often, even in firms of professionals. You might argue that's a person culture, but they tend these days to perhaps have more of a task culture than they used to. But one to remember as the fourth of Handy's culture types. One further point is just to think about whether one or more of these types of culture is particularly suitable in certain situations, certain business contexts, and whether certain leadership styles work best depending on the type of culture. Let's just pick a couple out. Let's pick out the top one there, the power culture. Well, we know that the power culture is all about power being held by those at the top. Therefore, you might argue, and I think you'd be right in arguing, that an autocratic leadership style is the most likely style you will find in a power culture, and perhaps it might even be, therefore, the most suitable leadership style. Whereas, let's take the one at the bottom, the person culture. If the organisation is really just a collection of individuals working together, then an autocratic leadership style would certainly be totally inappropriate. Perhaps the most appropriate leadership style, therefore, will be a democratic style, one that tries to bring together those individuals on a democratic basis rather than any other way. So there we go. That's a brief summary of Handy's 4 classes of culture, and I hope you found that useful.